At 1601 Wood Street in West Oakland, behind a freeway overpass, down a road that dead ends at a chain-link fence, there is a Beaux Arts train station with 40-foot ceilings, 3 massive arched windows, marble floors, and terracotta tile. It was designed by Jarvis Hunt, one of the finest railroad station architects in the country, and it opened on August 3, 1912. For decades, this was the western terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad, the last stop, the end of the line, the place where America ran out of continent. Hundreds of thousands of people stepped off trains here and into a new life. The building is locked. It has been closed since 1994. The marble is cracked. The windows are boarded or broken. Graffiti covers the lower walls. It has been about to be restored for 30 years. It is the most beautiful building in Oakland, and it is the most perfect symbol of what happened to this city. Because the story of Oakland is the story of a place that was always somebody else's gateway, somebody else's investment, somebody else's instrument. And every time the somebody moved on, Oakland got left with what remained. The city was not even supposed to be called Oakland. In 1850, it was just a patch of shoreline across the bay from San Francisco, known informally as Contra Costa, Spanish for opposite shore. That name tells you everything about how the world has always seen this place, not as a destination, but as the other side. 3 men, Horace Carpentier, Edson Adams, and Andrew Moon, arrived from the east with no money and considerable ambition, backed at one point by a small army of about 200 men hired out of San Francisco, and began squatting on land that belonged to the Peralta family, holders of a 44,000-acre Spanish land grant. Carpentier was a Columbia-trained lawyer from upstate New York, 26 years old, who had come to California for the gold rush but found that lawyering paid better than panning. He got himself appointed enrolling clerk in the state legislature, the man who handled copies of every new law. And in 1852, he slipped a bill through to incorporate the town of Contra Costa under a new name, Oakland. The residents, most of whom didn't even know their town had been renamed, woke up one morning to discover they were living in a city they hadn't voted for, named by a man most of them had never met. What Carpentier did next set the template for everything that would follow. 2 weeks after incorporation, on May 17, 1852, he persuaded the town's trustees to pass an ordinance granting him, personally, exclusively, complete control of Oakland's entire waterfront. The right to build every wharf, every pier, every dock. The right to collect duties on every piece of cargo that landed. In a port town, that meant Carpentier owned the mechanism by which money entered the city. He was elected the first mayor in 1854, in an election that produced more votes than voters. And when the fraud was discovered the following year, he was removed. But the waterfront stayed his. He later transferred his rights to an entity called the Oakland Waterfront Company, of which he made himself president. The city spent decades trying to break his grip. He eventually drifted back to New York, donated $200,000 to Columbia University, and died in 1918 at the age of 93, a respected philanthropist on the East Coast and a synonym for corruption on the West. Oakland was a city born from the theft of its own front door. The railroad arrived in the late 1860s, and it came to Oakland not because Oakland was important, but because Oakland's geography was useful. The Central Pacific needed a terminus on the bay, a place where trains could meet ferries, and Oakland's shoreline offered the flat land and the access. In 1868, they built the Oakland Long Wharf, a pier stretching out into the bay where passengers could transfer from rail to water. The wharf, the rail yards, the switching facilities, all of it was built in West Oakland, and for a generation it was the neighborhood's economic engine. The Southern Pacific Railroad, which absorbed the Central Pacific, became the city's largest employer. But the railroad wasn't investing in Oakland. It was investing in a corridor. Oakland was the place you passed through on the way to San Francisco. Still, corridors generate commerce, and Oakland grew. By 1880, the population had reached 34,000. By 1900, it was nearly 67,000. And then, at 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, the San Andreas Fault ruptured 2 miles offshore, and everything changed. The earthquake itself damaged Oakland badly. Brick buildings cracked, chimneys collapsed, water mains broke. The 12th Street Dam was compromised. But across the bay, San Francisco was being annihilated. The quake and the fires that followed destroyed 28,000 buildings and left more than 225,000 people homeless. Within 72 hours, over 150,000 refugees poured into Oakland, doubling the city's population in 3 days. They came by ferry, by rail, by any conveyance they could find. Oakland set up relief stations at the Broadway Depot, served hot coffee and bread, established shelter camps, and tried to absorb a human wave that exceeded anything the city had ever imagined. Many of those refugees never left. Oakland's population, which had been 67,000 in 1900, hit 150,000 by 1910. The city went from town to metropolis in a single decade, and it was built not on its own ambition, but on someone else's catastrophe. Entire neighborhoods materialized. The building boom produced the Union Bank building, the First National Bank, the Oakland Hotel, the Security Bank building. Tall buildings, real buildings, structures that announced a city confident enough to build upward. And behind that confidence was a man who understood that the real money wasn't in buildings at all. It was in the land around them. Francis Marion Smith was born in Wisconsin in 1846, prospected his way across the American West, and by the 1870s had discovered massive deposits of borax in the Nevada desert. His company's logo, the 20-mule team, became nationally famous. He made a fortune in cleaning supplies, settled in Oakland, built a mansion, and then looked around and saw an opportunity that had nothing to do with borax. Starting in the 1890s, Borax Smith began buying up every independent streetcar line in the East Bay. He and his partner Frank Havens created a company called the Realty Syndicate and purchased about 13,000 acres of undeveloped land, more than 20 square miles, in the hills and flatlands around Oakland. Then they built streetcar lines to serve that land. The genius of the scheme was that the transit system wasn't a transportation business. It was a real estate business. You laid track into empty hills, the track made the hills accessible, you sold the lots, and the buyers, who now needed the streetcar to get to work, became your captive customers. The streetcar system, eventually known as the Key System, stretched from Richmond to San Leandro, with a line running out on a pier into the bay where passengers transferred to ferries bound for San Francisco. At its peak in the 1920s, the Key System carried more than 100 million passengers a year. Smith and Havens didn't just build transit lines, they built destinations. In 1906, Smith constructed the Claremont Hotel, a grand resort in the hills above Berkeley, and ran a streetcar line directly to its front door. The E line terminated between 2 tennis courts on the hotel's lower grounds. He built Idora Park, an amusement park, as another ridership generator. He platted neighborhoods, Piedmont Pines, Havens Court, Key Route Heights, and named the streets after himself and his partners. For a decade, it looked like it might work. Then the East Bay didn't develop as fast as he had predicted. His land companies couldn't sell lots quickly enough to cover expenses. In 1913, Borax Smith's empire collapsed, and he was forced out of his own creation. He died in 1931, largely forgotten. The streetcar system he built would survive him by almost 3 decades, but it was never really profitable. The man who had built Oakland's transit network had built it to sell real estate. And when the real estate stopped selling, the transit was an orphan. But Oakland in the 1920s didn't know any of that yet. The 1920s were Oakland's decade, the closest the city ever came to standing fully upright next to San Francisco and looking it in the eye. In 1915, Joseph Noland, a former United States congressman, bought the Oakland Tribune newspaper. He moved its offices to a 6-story building at 13th and Franklin, the former Bruner Furniture Company. And in 1923, he hired architect Edward T. Folks to add a tower. Folks designed a 22-story clock tower inspired by the campanile at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, with a copper mansard roof that oxidized to a distinctive green. At 305 feet, it was the tallest building in Oakland, visible from virtually anywhere in the city. The newspaper's radio station, KLX, broadcast from the top floor. On the building's 9th story in 1923, Harry Houdini hung upside down in a straitjacket and freed himself in front of a crowd gathered on the street below. The Tribune Tower became Oakland's postcard, its proof that it was a real city with a real skyline. 5 years later, on October 27, 1928, the Fox Oakland Theater opened its doors at 1807 Telegraph Avenue. Designed by the firm of Weeks and Day in a style that mixed Art Deco with Moorish and Indian influences, the building cost an estimated $2 million. It seated 2,800 people under a ceiling so ornate, crystal chandeliers, painted murals, plasterwork thick as icing, that first-time visitors reportedly spent the entire first reel looking up instead of at the screen. William Fox, founder of Fox Film Corporation, built it as part of his national chain of movie palaces. 20,000 people tried to attend the opening. The building's tower, with its terracotta detailing and geometric patterns, rose above Telegraph Avenue like a secular cathedral. Oakland had its landmark theater, its landmark tower, its streetcar system, its port, its ferries, its neighborhoods climbing into the hills. The population hit 284,000 by 1930. Everything seemed to be pointing up. Then the Depression hit. Then the Depression ended. And what replaced it was something Oakland never recovered from. Not because it was bad, but because it was so overwhelmingly, deceptively good. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and within days the federal government transformed the entire San Francisco Bay into the most productive shipbuilding complex on Earth. The Oakland Army Base and Naval Base were created on hundreds of acres of reclaimed tideland. The port was brought under military control, and across the bay in Richmond, a man named Henry J. Kaiser, who had no experience whatsoever in building ships, secured contracts to construct hundreds of cargo vessels using assembly line techniques borrowed from the automobile industry. Kaiser's 4 Richmond shipyards employed nearly 80,000 workers at their peak. In Oakland proper, Moore Dry Dock employed another 35,000. But the Bay Area didn't have enough workers, so Kaiser sent trains south to Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, and recruited thousands of sharecroppers and tenant farmers, many of them black, with promises of steady wages and a new life in California. They came on special trains, entire families, arriving at the 16th Street station and stepping out of the Pullman cars into a West Oakland that was nothing like anything they had known. Before the war, black residents made up about 3% of Oakland's population, roughly 8,000 people. By 1950, that number had exploded to nearly 48,000, 12% of the city. The total population surged to over 400,000 by 1945, the highest in Oakland's history. And for a brief, extraordinary period, West Oakland became one of the most vibrant black communities in America. 7th Street, the neighborhood's commercial spine, was lined with barber shops, grocery stores, pharmacies, pool halls, restaurants, and, above all, music clubs. By the mid-1940s, more than 15 nightclubs operated along the corridor. They called it the Harlem of the West. Slim Jenkins' Supper Club was the upscale room where you dressed for dinner and heard polished jazz. Down the street, rougher joints played Delta blues brought north by the same men who had come to build ships. Lowell Fulson, Big Mama Thornton, Jimmy Witherspoon, Sugar Pie DeSanto, B.B. King, Aretha Franklin, they all played 7th Street. A man named Bob Geddens, working out of a studio at 7th and Center Streets under the label Big Town Records, became the first black record label owner in the Bay Area. He pressed his own records at his own plant, loaded them into the trunk of his car, and drove them to juke joints and record shops across California. The Pullman porters who worked the trains out of the 16th Street station carried those records east, and the music of Oakland's 7th Street spread across the country. It was the finest hour of the 16th Street station's life. Every train that arrived brought someone new. Every departure carried something Oakland had made, a record, a ship, a story. The station was, for once, not just a corridor. It was the center of something. But the war ended, and ending was the worst thing that could have happened. The shipyards closed, Moore Dry Dock scaled down, the defense jobs evaporated. And at exactly the moment Oakland's wartime economy collapsed, two forces arrived that would spend the next 3 decades dismantling the city from the inside. The first was the automobile. Before the war, most Oakland residents got around by streetcar, and the Key system, now running trains across the lower deck of the Bay Bridge into San Francisco, was the backbone of daily life. But returning GIs wanted cars, and the federal government wanted highways. In 1946, a company called National City Lines, backed by General Motors, Firestone Tires, and Standard Oil, acquired 64% of Key System stock. The streetcar lines were systematically dismantled and replaced with buses. In 1958, a Key System train crossed the Bay Bridge for the last time. The tracks were pulled up, the right-of-way was given over to automobiles. Oakland's transit spine was gone. The second force was concrete. In 1937, highway planners in Sacramento had begun drawing lines on maps, plotting where the new freeways would go. The routes they chose ran directly through Oakland's Asian, Latino, and black neighborhoods, the communities with the least political power to resist. When Interstate 880 was built, it slammed through Chinatown and the Mexican community west of Broadway. Then it continued north as the Cypress Street Viaduct, a double-decker freeway that opened on June 11, 1957, and cut directly through the heart of West Oakland. The structure functioned like a wall, dividing the neighborhood in half. Homes, businesses, a YMCA, and an orphanage were demolished or displaced. The construction of the Cypress Viaduct alone displaced over 600 families. Combined with the surrounding urban renewal projects, more than 5,000 housing units in West Oakland were destroyed. And the urban renewal was, if anything, worse than the highway. The Oakland Redevelopment Agency, created in 1956, designated about 50 blocks in West Oakland for demolition, including parts of the historic heart of 7th Street. The agency had the power of eminent domain. It could seize properties, raise them, and hand the land to developers. Its first project, the Acorn development, cleared the land and then did nothing with it for 5 years, leaving a giant barren patch in the middle of a neighborhood that had been alive with music and commerce just a decade earlier. The jazz clubs closed, the record shops shuttered, the barbers, the grocers, the pharmacists. They lost their customers to demolition crews and highway on-ramps. Meanwhile, the same freeways that gutted West Oakland made it easy for white residents to leave. The post-war suburbs, Walnut Creek, Concord, Fremont, Hayward, were suddenly 20 minutes away by car. The federal government was subsidizing home loans for white veterans through the GI Bill and the FHA, while redlining policies made it nearly impossible for black families to get mortgages in the new suburbs. The white middle class drove out on the freeways. The black working class stayed behind in neighborhoods that had just been cut in half by elevated concrete. Between 1950 and 1970, Oakland lost nearly 10,000 jobs and 23,000 residents. Alameda County as a whole gained manufacturing jobs during the same period. The jobs didn't disappear. They moved to the suburbs, on the roads that Oakland's tax dollars had helped build. Later, Interstate 980 was completed in 1985, and it created a literal wall between West Oakland and downtown, A sunken freeway with sheer concrete embankments that made it nearly impossible to cross on foot. West Oakland was now entirely encircled by freeways. I-880 to the west, I-980 to the east, I-580 to the north. A neighborhood that had once been the center of black life in the Bay Area was physically cut off from the rest of its own city. The cruelest irony came at 5:04 in the afternoon on October 17, 1989. The Loma Prieta earthquake, magnitude 6.9, struck the Bay Area during Game 3 of the World Series, a World Series between the Oakland Athletics and the San Francisco Giants, with 62,000 fans watching at Candlestick Park. Across the bay, the upper deck of the Cypress Viaduct, the freeway that had been ran through West Oakland 32 years earlier, pancaked onto the lower deck, crushing the cars beneath it like a hand closing on a row of tin cans. 42 people died in the collapse. The structure had not been seismically sound. Engineers had known for years that its reinforced concrete design was vulnerable. The freeway that had destroyed the neighborhood now killed people inside it. After the collapse, West Oakland residents fought successfully to prevent Caltrans from simply rebuilding the freeway on the same route. The Cypress Viaduct was demolished, and the roadway was rerouted around the western and southern edges of the neighborhood. In its place, a tree-lined boulevard was built, Mandela Parkway, named for Nelson Mandela. It was an improvement. But the vibrant community that the freeway had originally displaced, the clubs, the shops, the homes, that was gone. You cannot plant trees on top of a wound and call it healed. 2 years after the earthquake, on October 19, 1991, Oakland absorbed another blow. A small brush fire in the hills above the city, the kind that had burned the same slopes 3 previous times in the century, reignited after firefighters thought it was controlled. Pushed by fierce Diablo winds, it exploded into a firestorm. At its peak, the fire was destroying one house every 11 seconds. In its first hour, 790 structures burned. The Hiller Highlands neighborhood, 1,800 townhomes, was consumed in minutes. Residents fled down winding hillside roads, some abandoning their cars and running on foot as the fire overtook them. 9 people died on a single stretch of Charing Cross Road when a burning car fell from a ridge above and blocked their escape route. By the time the winds died down that evening, 25 people were dead, 150 were injured, and 3,469 homes and apartment units had been destroyed. The damage totaled $1.5 billion, more than $3 billion in today's money. If the winds had continued, the fire would have reached downtown Oakland. So by the early 1990s, the ledger looked like this. The freeways had dismembered West Oakland. The earthquake had killed 42 people in the wreckage of a freeway that should never have been built there. The firestorm had destroyed 3,400 homes in the hills. And the Fox Theater, that Moorish palace on Telegraph Avenue, had been closed since 1973 and sat empty, its interior deteriorating, its marquee dark. The Tribune Tower was still standing, but the newspaper that gave it its name had been damaged in the earthquake and moved its offices to Jack London Square. The 16th Street station, closed in 1994, was slowly succumbing to vandalism and water damage. Oakland was a city of magnificent buildings that nobody was using. And then the teams started leaving. Oakland had once been a 3-sport city, a rare and genuine thing. The Raiders played football at the Coliseum. The Athletics played baseball there, too, sharing the same aging concrete bowl. The Golden State Warriors played basketball at the Oakland Arena next door. For decades, you could watch professional football in the fall, basketball in the winter, and baseball in the summer without ever leaving Oakland. The teams were woven into the city's identity, especially in black and working-class neighborhoods where the silver and black of the Raiders or the green and gold of the A's were marks of loyalty and place. The Warriors left first. In 2019, the team moved across the bay to San Francisco, to the Chase Center, a gleaming billion-dollar arena on the waterfront. The Warriors had played in Oakland since 1971. They had won championships there. But San Francisco had money, and Oakland did not, and the economics were simple. The Warriors are now the most valuable team in the NBA, worth an estimated $9 billion, according to one analysis. They earned that valuation in San Francisco. The Raiders left next. The team had been born in Oakland in 1960, moved to Los Angeles in 1982, returned to Oakland in 1995, and then, in 2020, moved again, this time to Las Vegas, lured by a $1.9 billion stadium underwritten by $750 million in public subsidies. Raiders owner Mark Davis blamed the Athletics for squatting on a Coliseum lease that prevented stadium improvements. The Athletics blamed the city for not building them a new ballpark. The city blamed both teams for not investing. Everyone blamed everyone, and the Raiders left. The Athletics were last. After 57 years in Oakland, the A's played their final home game on September 26, 2024, a 3-2 win over the Texas Rangers. Fans came dressed in funeral attire. Some cried openly. The team is moving to Sacramento temporarily, then to Las Vegas permanently. Major League Baseball owners approved the relocation unanimously. In the space of 5 years, Oakland went from a 3-sport city to a no-sport city. The Coliseum, once home to sold-out playoff games, Rickey Henderson stealing bases, the autumn wind echoing through the corridors, is now an empty concrete monument to civic failure. The city tried to sell its 50% stake in the Coliseum site to a developer called the African American Sports and Entertainment Group for $125 million and planned to use the money to plug its budget deficit. The developer's payments have been late and controversial. The deal was negotiated under Mayor Shang Tao, who was recalled by 60% of voters in November 2024, the first successful mayoral recall in Oakland's history, and subsequently indicted by federal prosecutors on conspiracy and bribery charges in an unrelated corruption case. She has pleaded not guilty. The Coliseum deal, as of now, is still technically alive. That budget deficit, by the way, is not a small number. In 2023, Oakland faced the largest shortfall in its history, $360 million over 2 fiscal years. The city's real estate transfer tax revenue, a levy on property sales that had been booming during the pandemic housing rush, collapsed. The city had budgeted for $110 million from the tax. It collected $53 million. Officials said real estate transaction volume was lower than during the Great Recession. The Finance Department projects a structural annual deficit of roughly $120 million through 2027. The businesses that generated tax revenue have been leaving. In September 2023, Target closed its stores in Oakland, citing threats to employee and customer safety. In November 2023, 2 Starbucks locations and a Subway on Hegenberger Road closed after repeated car break-ins targeting their customers. In January 2024, a Denny's that had been on Hegenberger Road for 54 years shut down after a series of crimes. The same month, In-N-Out Burger, a brand so beloved in California that its closures make statewide news, announced it was closing its only Oakland location, citing danger to employees and customers. It was the first In-N-Out to close in the chain's history. Robberies in Oakland increased 38% in 2023. Burglaries rose 23%. Motor vehicle theft jumped 44%. Roughly 1 out of every 30 Oakland residents had a car stolen that year. There were over 14,500 motor vehicle thefts, nearly 2 per hour around the clock every day of the year. In September 2023, more than 200 business owners shut their doors for a day in a coordinated strike, a desperate plea to city leaders for more police and better public safety. The city's police department was short about 100 officers. Kaiser Permanente, one of Oakland's largest employers, sent a memo to downtown workers suggesting they bring their own food to the office or have it delivered rather than going out for lunch, following a string of daytime robberies. The Catholic Diocese of Oakland announced that St. Anthony's School would close because of serious safety concerns, including the presence of human trafficking operations near the school grounds. A restaurant called Kingston 11, a community food center serving low-income families, had its glass doors smashed by vandals. Eddie's Drive-In Liquors was hit by smash-and-grab robbers 4 times between November 2023 and early 2024, including once when thieves drove a truck through the glass storefront. California Governor Gavin Newsom eventually deployed 120 California Highway Patrol officers to Oakland in a surge operation to crack down on theft and violent crime. The deployment was, effectively, an admission that the city could not police itself. The irony that sits beneath all of this is that Oakland still has things that most struggling cities would kill for. The Port of Oakland handles 99% of the containerized goods entering and leaving Northern California. It supports nearly 100,000 jobs in the region and $174 billion in annual economic activity. It processes roughly 2.3 million container units a year and was the first major West Coast port to invest in container shipping infrastructure back in the 1960s. Oakland International Airport serves millions of passengers annually. The city sits at the center of one of the richest metropolitan economies in the world, ringed by technology companies and venture capital, a 20-minute train ride from San Francisco, a 40-minute drive from Silicon Valley. It has Lake Merritt, a tidal lagoon in the middle of downtown surrounded by parks, one of the oldest wildlife sanctuaries in America, designated in 1870. It has hills that give you views of the entire Bay Area, from the Golden Gate to the San Mateo Bridge on a clear day. It has the Fox Theater, which was finally gorgeously restored and reopened in 2009 as a concert venue after sitting dark for 36 years. The restoration was championed by Phil Tagami, an Oakland native and high school dropout whose parents had their first date at the Fox. He had been laughed at when he first proposed it. He got it done. Oakland is not a city that lacks assets. It is a city that has never been allowed, or never figured out how, to deploy those assets for its own benefit. The port generates billions in economic activity, but the jobs are in logistics and shipping, not in the neighborhoods where people live. The airport serves the region, not the city. The freeways move commuters through Oakland. They don't stop. The real estate that drove the city's tax base was always speculative. It boomed when San Francisco got too expensive and busted when the market softened. Oakland's economy has been, for most of its history, a derivative of San Francisco's economy, the way a shadow is a derivative of the thing casting it. When San Francisco prospers, some of the prosperity spills east. When it contracts, Oakland has nothing of its own to fall back on. The population tells the story in numbers. In 1860, Oakland had 1,543 residents. By 1910, it had 150,174. By 1930, 284,063. The wartime peak was around 405,000 in 1945. The 1950 census recorded 384,575. By 1980, it had dropped to about 339,000. It climbed back modestly through the 2010s, reaching roughly 440,000 by 2020, driven largely by spillover from San Francisco's housing crisis. But that growth came with a profound demographic shift. Oakland was 47% black in 1980. By 2020, it was 20% black. The number of black residents has dropped every decade for 40 years. Rising housing costs, loss of industry, and safety concerns pushed black families to Antioch, Fairfield, Stockton, cities 50 and 60 miles inland, places that are cheaper precisely because they offer less of what Oakland once had. The community that built 7th Street, that filled the churches and the clubs, that shaped Oakland's culture from the 1940s onward, has been steadily dispersed. What remains in downtown Oakland today is a mixture of striking architecture, empty storefronts, and new residential buildings whose ground floor retail spaces were never leased. The Tribune Tower still stands at 13th and Franklin, its green copper roof still visible across the flats. But the newspaper is long gone. The Oakland Tribune published its last independent edition years ago, absorbed into a chain of East Bay papers. The tower was converted into residential and commercial space. Across downtown, office vacancy rates have climbed as remote work hollowed out the weekday population. The streets that were supposed to bustle with tech workers and new residents are quiet. There is a photograph from 1956, you can find it online, of 14th Street in West Oakland looking east toward downtown. The street is lined with 2- and 3-story buildings, awnings over shop fronts, cars parked at the curb, pedestrians on the sidewalk. It looks like a working American city. There is a matching photograph taken from the same spot in 2015. The buildings are gone. In their place is an empty lot, a freeway overpass, and the blank side of a warehouse. Between those two photographs is the entire history of post-war Oakland, a city that was systematically taken apart, piece by piece, by forces that were always presented as improvements. The freeway that would ease traffic, the urban renewal that would clear blight, the redevelopment that would attract investment. Each improvement required the demolition of something that was actually working. Each demolition made the next one easier to justify because the neighborhood was a little more damaged, a little more vacant, a little less worth fighting for. Oakland's leaders have not lacked for plans. There have been waterfront revitalization schemes, transit-oriented development proposals, downtown housing initiatives, port expansion projects, and most recently, the attempted sale of the Coliseum for redevelopment. Some have succeeded. The Fox Theater restoration is real, Jack London Square has some life, the port continues to function. But the structural deficit remains, the police shortage remains, the population of black residents continues to shrink. The city's only remaining major league sports venue is an empty concrete oval with no team and no clear future. The mayor was recalled and indicted. The next mayor, Barbara Lee, a longtime congresswoman, took office in May 2025 and inherited a fiscal crisis that makes nearly every other problem harder to solve. The 16th Street station still stands at the end of Wood Street. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in January 2025, a recognition that came more than a century after it opened and more than 30 years after it closed. A housing developer has proposed building 90 homes on the vacant land around it, and perhaps restoring the station itself. The proposal has been in discussion for years. The arched windows, the terracotta tiles, the 40-foot ceilings, they are all still there behind the boards and the graffiti. The building was designed to welcome people arriving. It was built with marble and stone to say, "You have reached the end of a very long journey, and the place you have arrived is worthy of you." Nobody arrives at the 16th Street station anymore. The train stopped running through it 3 decades ago. But if you stand on Wood Street and look up at those 3 great arches, you can still read in the architecture a promise that was made to a city. The promise was that Oakland was going to be something, not the other side of the bay, not a corridor, not a place you drove through on your way somewhere better, but a city in its own right, with its own skyline and its own music and its own reason for being. It was a good promise. Nobody kept it.